Okay everyone, this is the last video. I'm sitting in a fairly awkward position because I wanted to get you a bit closer to the screen for this. Essentially in this video I'm going to read you Voices in the Park. So cross your legs, sit on the floor and get your primary school on. And then we'll just look at the first section. So normally what I would do in class is look at the first two sections with you and then get you into small groups and look at the the third and the fourth section and report back from small groups. And we'll do that in class, but we might do it for sections 2, 3 and 4 in our second lesson in the first 40 or so minutes. But we'll look at the whole text together. Then we'll look at section 1 and I'll sort of show you what a literature reading is like. And then we'll come back together and in person say hello and get on with things from this point. So here's Voices in the Park by Anthony Brown. Oops, sorry, wrong page. Here we go, we're on this page now. So Voices in the Park is actually broken into 4 voices. That's not a very good position, is it? Let me see if I can do better than that. Where are we going? We need to get you into a completely different position. Sorry, I should have really worked this out beforehand rather than worrying about where my own face was. That's pretty good there, isn't it? Is that okay? Okay, we'll get something to prop that up. There we go. So, Voices in the Park is told through 4 voices. The 4 main characters in the story each have their own turn at telling the story, which is a fairly old device. It's actually a device from a Japanese story called In a Grove, which has been borrowed by lots of films. I can't think of any from off the top of my head, but you'll know, episodes of TV shows that have been told in this way, and I'm sure the film will come to me as we're reading. So here it is, Voice in the Park. First voice. It was time to take Victoria, our pedigree Labrador, and Charles, our son, for a walk. When we arrived at the park, I let Victoria off her lead. Immediately some scruffy mongrel appeared and started bothering her. I shooed it off, but the horrible thing chased her all over the park. I ordered it to go away, but it took no notice of me whatsoever. Sit, I said to Charles. Here. I was just planning what we should have to eat that evening when I saw Charles had disappeared. Oh dear, where had he gone? You get some frightful types in the park these days. I called his name for what seemed like an age. Then I saw him talking to a very rough-looking child. Charles, come here, at once, I said. And come here, please, Victoria. We walked home in silence. Second voice. I need to get out of the house. So me and Smudge took the dog to the park. He loves it there. I wish I had half the energy he's got. I settled on a bench and looked through the paper for a job. I know it's a waste of time really, but you've got to have a bit of hope, haven't you? Then it was time to go. Smudge cheered me up. She chatted happily to me all the way home. Third voice. I was at home on my own again. It's so boring. Then Mummy said that it was time for our walk. There was a very friendly dog in the park, and Victoria was having a great time. I wished I was. Do you want to come on and slide? A voice asked. It was a girl, unfortunately. But I went anyway. She was brilliant on the slide. She went really fast. I was amazed. The 2 dogs raced around like old friends. The girl took off her coat and swung on the climbing frame. So I did the same. I'm good at climbing trees, so I showed her how to do it. She told me her name was Smudge, a funny name I know, but she's quite nice. Then Mummy caught us talking together and I had to go home. Maybe Smudge will be there next time. Fourth voice. Dad had been really fed up, so I was pleased when he said we could take Albert to the park. Albert's always in such a hurry to be let off his lead. He went straight up to this lovely dog and sniffed its bum. He always does that. Of course, the other dog didn't mind, but its owner was really angry, a silly twit. I got talking to this boy. I thought he was a bit of a wimp at first, but he's okay. We played on the seesaw, and he didn't say much, but later on he was a bit more friendly. We both burst out laughing when we saw Albert having a swim. Then we all played on the bandstand, and I felt really, really happy. Charlie picked a flower and gave it to me. Then his mum called him, and he had to go. He looked sad. When I got home, I put the flower in some water and made Dad a nice cup of tea. And that's the end. So, fairly simple story, you would have to agree. We'll flick back through it to go back to that start. Essentially, you know, a very brief visit to a park is the subject matter of the story, and it's told by the four participants, the four members of two families, a mother and son, and a father and daughter. Obviously, the mother and son and the father and daughter are very different. They're very different from each other, and they're also very different from each family to each other. So Anthony Brown is an author-illustrator, which means he writes and illustrates both aspects of a children's picture book, the verbal, which is the written work, and the visual, which is the illustrations. And it's a bit different from having an illustrator, someone who gets the printed story and then decides what they're going to draw, perhaps through some discussion. He's got both things going on in his mind, and the nice thing is that there's a very clear connection between them, and the meaning therefore is constructed equally by both. It's the relationship between the verbal and the visual material. Sometimes the verbal material tells us a lot. The visual material might tell us something else, and combined those two things will communicate the idea. So you might have noticed as I was reading that this is a PDF. You hopefully will have downloaded this from the blog, and perhaps you might have read it before you've watched the video, and certainly go back and read it and have a more of a lingering look at some of the illustrations, which are unbelievably good. But you will have noticed that there's some little annotations along the way asking you questions or focusing you on certain things, and we'll look at those together, and we'll look at those in class for voices 2, 3 and 4. But let's have a look at the first voice. So here is the mother, and you can see in the questions, and they're all very easy to answer, these questions, and I'm certainly not expecting you to record these answers anywhere. You can make notes in a notebook if you wish, but I'm not taking this up as part of your journal work or anything like that. So the first question is, who is the narrator? What are they like and how do we know? So we know that the narrator is the mother, called Mummy by her son Charles, called a silly twit by Smudge, the girl from the other family. But what do we know about her? Well, the house tells us a great deal. The house is he's an English author, so this is for, I guess, an English audience or an English reader. And the house tells us a great deal because the house is idyllic, beautiful white clean walls, which means it's pure. It's probably upper middle class, not upper class. It's 2-story, you know, and it's not a mansion. It's not a stately home. One of those big brick castle-y things that you see on TV sometimes. It's just a nice home with a standard white fence and a bit of a yard and things like that. So this is a middle-class family who perhaps she thinks that she's a bit more than middle class. So what tells us that? Well, the image tells us that. The tone of voice of the narrator, which is the next question down, tells us that. And how can we define that tone of voice? Well, we can talk about the pedigree Labrador, the idea that it's important to indicate that the Labrador is a pedigree, it's purebred, it's not some sort of mutt or crossbreed. Even the complex nature of the sentence. If we talk grammatically, this is a compound complex sentence. It's got two main clauses. It was time to take Victoria for a walk. And she adds the information about Charles and the Labrador. So there's actually three clauses here. And the two middle clauses, the Labrador and Charles, are embedded inside the first one. So it's a complex sentence. So it means that she's quite sophisticated in the way that she talks, and that helps establish the tone. The child and the dog's name, what do you notice? Well, hopefully you have noticed that Victoria and Charles are both royal names. So Queen Victoria, Prince Charles. And they're also very English. Because of that. So, she has aspirations perhaps to be very grand and very regal. We also can tell what's important is that the dog is mentioned first. Victoria, who is purebred, pedigree, and sort of a mark of pride, is put first before the son. The son, perhaps secondary thought, and that tells us something about the mother, and perhaps it makes us not like her very much. Because remember, this is written for a child, probably for a child to be read to by their parent. And like I did, the parent is sort of encouraged by the way that the typeface changes and things like that to perhaps affect a bit of a voice. And particularly true on secondary or third readings, as the child requests it again and again, which my children have done. And I toned down the voices a little bit for you because it sounds a bit silly otherwise. But hopefully you can see all of the answers, and you might be able to see other things. Things like just here how the son is almost completely obscured by the mother in the illustration. The presence of all these straight lines in terms of control and order, the absence of any clutter from the house, so there's no, bushes or anything out front, there's nothing in the garden, it's all very clean and crisp, which is the sense that we get this mother likes. On the next page over here, and this is, I've printed this in the way that you would have it in front of you in the book, so this is actually a double page spread. So we would see this immediately next to us. What's the impact of the phrase, the scruffy mongrel? So it's here. Immediately some scruffy mongrel appeared. How much of the dog can we as an audience see? If you can't quite make it out, you might just be able to see just here. We see the snout of the dog. So we don't see enough of it really to make any sort of a judgment, but this woman is very judgmental. To some extent, I need you just to ignore the fact that she's a gorilla. Her son is a chimpanzee. That's just the style of the author. And it doesn't necessarily carry any meaning. The different species of apes. Children are always chimpanzees pretty much in Anthony Brown's work, and adults are always gorillas. It's just the way he does things. So ignore that. But here we have, the scruffy mongrel being indicated, and we can barely see the dog. The narration differs from the reality of the instruction in that way. So they've arrived at the park, and immediately this scruffy mongrel was bothering her. Well, it's not really doing anything. The horrible thing chased her all over the park. Well, that's certainly not reflected here. Victoria, the pedigree, is standing perfectly still. And actually in the next picture, if you look here, Victoria is the one doing the chasing that scruffy mongrel. So again, on the page turn, there is a reveal that the narration on the previous page is actually somewhat different from the reality that we can see. So on this page, on this double page spread, we have a few questions as well. What does the body language of the characters tell us? So in terms of the design, we can see she's facing this way. Charles is facing this way. They're quite separated. She's very straight-backed and formal, legs together, hands clasped, and her eyes are closed. She's not really paying attention to what's going on around her. That tells us a great deal about what she's like. It also tells us a lot about the relationship between the two, which we can make certain judgments about and understand them when there's no exposition, there's no description or discussion from any of the characters. There's a slight suggestion from Charles in the third voice about what the relationship is like with his mother. What's the effect of ordering the dog to go away and then using these words sit and hear to Charles? You know, she's someone who's very much in control. And in fact, the way she talks to her son is the way that we might talk to a dog. She uses commands. Sit. Here. And this is the way she speaks to her son. It's not the way she speaks to Victoria the dog. What's Charles looking at? So it might be hard to see on the video, but certainly, hopefully in the PDF, you can make it out. We can just see on the very edge of the illustration here a leg and an arm, and if we flick further into the text we can see that they're the same colour as Smudge's clothes. And then if we look at the next image, we see that we've pulled back a bit and we imagine that Charles was sitting here and Smudge was sitting next to her father, and we would only get that on a rereading, but we can analyse in that way. Compare and contrast the man and the woman. So you might notice that actually we're given a lamp post in this image to almost divide the image in half, but the mother has a lot of space here. The father is cramped into this side of the image, and what else we might be able to notice is that there's quite a lot of rubbish and dirt, and the litter bin is on his side, whereas her side is the grass is lovely and green. Now I actually bring the copy of the picture book with me to class next time, and you'll actually see that this side is actually slightly darker in terms of the colour as well. It's hard to see in the scan. He's sitting, she's standing. He's wearing quite dirty clothes. He's got a frowning face. She's standing up. She's dressed very properly, string of pearls around her neck. Very formal coat, some bright colours, and he's quite dark. So what does that tell us? Maybe it tells us something about their status. He's lower class, she's middle class, and they know it. And perhaps this is about how she sees him as much as the way that he actually is. Look at the trees in the background, their faces. And what's the significance of that representation? Well, they're mirroring her. And so she's having an impact on the entire environment. The environment sort of models or mirrors her shock and horror at this vagrant sitting on the chair next to her, or the fact that her dog has gone missing. Now, if you look in the very far corner, there's no question about this, but in the very far corner here, we can actually see Victoria and Albert, which is also a royal name, actually, are behind a tree, but they've become one dog. Hard to see in the video here, but if you look at your scan, you'll see that we have the front half of Victoria, the rear half of Albert, and it's like that little optical illusion sitting behind the tree looking like one long sausage dog. And so they've overcome their differences, whereas here the differences are very, very pronounced. So if we flick back, we see the trees here with their big open mouth and slanted sort of concerned looking eyes reflected here in the image of the mother. So almost exactly the same. So if we flick back again, look here, look at this one particularly here, and then we flick forward and we see the same thing here. And again, we have the idea of her controlling nature. So if you actually notice, if you follow the line of her mouth to the trees, this is wind, but it's almost like it's coming from her and she's blowing the trees over. And actually, she's blowing them out of the image. So she breaks the frame. This is called the frame of the illustration. just drawn on my screen there, but she breaks the frame of the illustration with her hat, so she's larger than life, and actually she forces the natural environment beyond its frame as well. Bit symbolic, but that's certainly there. Who is the frightful type? She refers to the frightful type in the park. Exclamation mark shows her shock and horror. Who's the frightful type? Oop, wrong way. Here's the frightful type. So the connotative language is very important here because it tells us how she views this person. He doesn't look overly frightful, and certainly having met him in the second voice, we understand him better than she does, perhaps. Look over here, this is another case of the language, the verbal material and the visual material working against each other for a purpose. How does the image challenge the narration? She saw him talking to a very rough-looking child. Well, how can she tell? This is from her point of view. Look at how small the characters are. Even in the printed copy, which is much higher resolution, obviously, than this, there's not a lot of detail there for her to make any sort of judgment. So she's making sort of snap judgments based upon everyone's rough looking compared to her child. And again, we have the difference between the way she talks to her son, come here at once, the way you talk to an animal or a dog, and come here please, Victoria. There's the pleasantry in the use of the word please that's absent in the way that she talks to her dog. Even things like the visual here, the separation of this sentence from this sentence by some white space, there's a frustration which is resulting in them walking home alone in silence. How does this build on elements already established? Well, we have the repetition of that tone of voice compared with the dog and the son. We have the idea of the judgments being made very hastily based on very little information. In this last image for her voice, the question always comes up if I do this with a class, why is that tree on fire? Answer, I don't know. Have no idea. There's lots of theories, and I'm not going to posit any of them because I'm interested to hear what you would say. You might notice also that one of the spikes on the gate is also on fire. I'm interested to know what you think the symbolism of the tree burning might represent. What does fire represent? What does burning represent? What does a tree represent, and why might it be being destroyed? An easier one. Why is there a trail of leaves following the mother and Charles? Who is it following? Who is bringing the park out with them? Is it the mother, or is it Charles, or is it Victoria? Notice again, replicating that earlier image in the text. Here, we can barely see Charles. We can barely see Charles here. Okay, just here. Hardly see him. He's completely overshadowed by his mother. Now, to me, it looks like the leaves are following her footsteps, but people have convincingly argued, students have convincingly argued that they could easily be Charles's steps because we actually can't see his feet, or they could be Victoria's because we can't see where her back foot is either. And I think that a valid interpretation, although again I've heard many, and I'm interested to see what you say as well, is that because they're dead leaves, they're autumn leaves, and a lot of the park is not in autumn, some of the trees are, it's sort of sad, it represents sadness or the loss of something. That idea that the falling leaves are the loss of life, and the park for Charles represented life and vibrancy, and then the loss of those is following him, and he's sort of depressed or upset or sad, which is the observation that Smudge makes later. Others have said that somehow there's change being represented in the falling leaves, and change is following them home, and I think that's interesting too. So that's sort of a taste of the sort of things that we do in literature. And even to the point where there might be times when I say, what do you think this is? I don't know what it actually means. I don't have a teacher's version of this book that tells me what it means. These are just my own insights. Sometimes there's, you know, text guides and things like that that you can refer to, but they're only someone's interpretation. They're not necessarily what's intended, and to some extent what Anthony Brown intended the fire in the tree to represent isn't important. It's what we think it might represent that really matters. So this is the sort of thing that we do. Together, we'll go on to look at the second voice, and then in small groups I'll get you to look at the third voice and the fourth voice in class, and we'll do that in our next lesson. So hopefully you've had a chance to review that. I certainly would encourage you to read back over the start of the text, read the text again, now that you've had that little bit of insight. Have a bit more of a think about the questions if you feel like I've gone through them fairly quickly. See if there's anything else you can see in those images and share them back with us in class. So, moving this back a little bit. Yes, I am still here. It's not a disembodied voice. That's the end of our videos for the Total Fireband Day that unfortunately we've worked through. I'm loading the first video now on my other screen, and possibly by Thursday they'll be uploaded. They're fairly long. It's probably ended up being about the equivalent of our class time, about 80 minutes in total. 3 25-minute videos, that's pretty good. So hopefully this has been a good introduction to literature. Hopefully this has worked for you. Hopefully it's made it a bit easier than just throwing the documents at you. And as I said in the last two videos, if you have any questions, take the time to write them down on a piece of paper, email them to me, or certainly bring them in on Thursday, and we'll set aside some time to resolve those. Hope you have a good time in literature this year. I'm certainly looking forward to it. I always enjoy meeting a new Year 11 class and spending the next 2 years working with you. It's a fantastic subject. It's the subject that I love to teach. It's the reason that I keep teaching year in, year out. And I hope that transfers through to you and you enjoy it as much as I do. And we'll continue in our next lesson. Okay.